Welcome back, and now it's time for our press review for today. Let's take a look on some of the main headlines of our local newspapers, and let's start by reading the banner of Al-Ahram newspaper. The Islamic Summit of the OIC warns of dividing the Palestinian West Bank and the extremism in Mali. The OIC countries support Egypt's initiative regarding the Syrian crisis and the terrorism and extremism in Mali. President Mohamed Morsi headed the closing session of the 12th summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which convened on Thursday in Cairo, with Syria's civil war and the battle in Mali topping the agenda. Leaders of Muslim nations called for a serious dialogue between Syria's government and an opposition coalition on a political transition to end nearly 2 years of civil war, but pinned most of the blame for the bloodshed on the state. For more details, we've got this report, and we will be back.
A number of political parties and groups have called for mass anti-government protests on Friday. The day's protests have been given different monikers in the media, with some labeling it Departure Friday, while the 38 organizations that are behind the call to demonstrate described it as the Friday of Human Dignity. Among the parties and movements that declare their participation in the protests on Friday were the Constitution Party, the Popular Current, the Free Egyptians Party, the Maspiri Youth Union, the Coalition of Revolutionary Powers, and the Free Front for Peaceful Change. The call to protest raised political and economic grievances, including the sacrifice of social justice for the sake of the IMF loan and the issue of torture and detention of protesters. The call comes after widely published reports of human rights violations against protesters involved in recent anti-government rallies, including reports of mass torture. According to the Liberal Constitution Party, the protests will include several rallies from locations in Cairo and Giza following Friday prayers to both Tahrir Square and the Presidential Palace in Heliopolis. There are also reports and rallies planned in several governorates, including Ismailia, Suez, Alexandria, Al-Mahalla, Sharqiyya, and Monofia. The Ahmed Maher Front, a splinter group of the April 6 youth movement, hasn't yet announced its position on the protest, and the Democratic Front of the April 6 youth movement has announced it will participate in several governorates.
As we saw together, today is another Friday of demonstrations. We read from Al Jumhuriya newspaper that marches dubbed Retaining the Dignity Friday roam streets calling for the rights of the martyrs. Political powers organized other marches dubbed the Departure Friday. So today we are expecting protests to erupt in Tahrir Square and also in front of the Ittihadiyya Presidential Palace, as well as in cities all over the country. Right, and back to Al-Ahram newspaper, moving on to something else. Al-Azhar says that blood shedding is a sin and condemns a fatwa calling for killing opposition figures. Al-Azhar, the Sunni Muslim world's premier Islamic institution, feared that such edicts open the doors of sedition and chaos of killing and bloodshed. In a statement, it called upon Egyptians to adhere to the position of the Islamic law, which emphasizes the sanctity of blood. And still with Al-Ahram newspaper, read from page 1, Minister of Transportation Dr. Haytham Abdul Latif warns of a great lack of spare parts which would threaten the train service. Abdul Latif said that the railway officials sometimes find themselves obliged to use old spare parts. Minister of Planning and International Cooperation Ashraf El-Arabi agreed to allocate £853 million to develop the railway services. Sounds good. Hopefully. And the higher prosecution of the public funds called for immunity from Councillor Ahmed Zind, accusing him of looting lands. El-Zind is accused of looting lands owned by residents in Marsa Matruh. The general prosecutor will discuss the accusation with members of the Supreme Judicial Council next week. And Prime Minister Hisham Kandil warns of economic and social challenges. U.S. Ambassador to Egypt Ann Patterson says that Washington is keen on supporting Cairo in the current situation. Kandil said that the poverty rates in Egypt rose to 52%, while the illiteracy rates have risen to 62%. And moving on to the Al newspaper, let's take a look on the first page, and here we have this article. In a race with time to stop the economic bleeding,
Minister of Tourism Hisham Zazou called upon rescuing tourism sector in Egypt. The US dollar's exchange rate against the Egyptian pound stabilized and deposits started to increase in banks.
And more economic news from a Gorhea newspaper. The Egyptian stock market ignores calls for retaining dignity, marches, and closes with a congressional increase in all indices. The benchmark EGX 30 index rose 0.21% to reach 5,702.93 points. The broader EGX 70 index closed up at 482.82 points, and the more expanded EGX 100 index also added 0.05% to close at 811.12 points.
And finally, from a Gumhuriyya newspaper, President Mohamed Morsi held talks on Thursday with his Turkish counterpart Abdullah Gül. The bilateral talks aimed at boosting Egyptian-Turkish ties in all fields, notably expanding economic, trade and investment cooperation between the two nations. The talks also tackled a number of regional issues topped by the Syrian crisis and means of implementing a ceasefire soon, apart from foreign interference. Well, let's take a look on this report and we'll be back.
For a peaceful resolution to the Syrian conflict through serious dialogue between the regime and its foes, as Iran voiced reservations at a summit concluded on Thursday. Leaders and representatives of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation also said they support efforts to help Mali regain its territorial integrity, an apparent reference to France's military intervention in the African country. The summit was held in the absence of Syria, with the 57-member OIC suspended in August because of a bloody crackdown on protests against President Bashar al-Assad. It called for a peaceful solution to the conflict, which has been ravaging Syria for nearly 23 months. Iran, the Assad's regime top regional ally, had reservations about the passage or two in the statement on Syria, according to OIC Secretary General Ahmadinejad Ihsan Oghlu. Iraq and Lebanon also expressed reservation about the text, according to a source close to the delegates at the summit. The Syrian conflict, which the UN says has killed more than 60,000 people so far, has divided the Security Council, with China and Russia having blocked 3 resolutions critical of the Assad regime. Ahmed Mu'azz al-Khatib, leader of the Syrian National Coalition umbrella opposition bloc, has offered to hold peace talks with Syria's Vice President Farouk al-Shara. But his proposal has been rejected by the Syrian National Council, the main component of the coalition, while the embattled regime in Damascus has yet to publicly respond to it. President Mohamed Morsi said after the summit he hoped for a ceasefire soon in Syria. Morsi said in a meeting between Egypt, Turkey and Iran on the sidelines of the summit that it discussed the general framework to resolve the crisis in Syria. The Syrian conflict, in which majority Sunni-led rebels are trying to oust the minority Alawite-dominated regime of al-Assad, has further hardened long-standing sectarian tensions between the Sunnis and the Shiites.
Now, with this last report, we come to a wrap-up of our press review for this morning. We do have more coming up on the breakfast show. That right now we're going to go to a brief break with the sports segment, everything that happened in the past 24 hours in the world of sports, with our reporter Ahmed Nader, and we'll be right back, so please stay tuned.